Nora Chen stared at her laptop screen in disbelief. After 3 weeks of scrolling through overpriced studio apartments that looked like glorified closets, she'd finally found something that seemed too good to be true. A spacious bedroom in a Victorian house, complete with kitchen access and garden views, for half the price of anything comparable near campus. The photos showed gleaming hardwood floors, tall windows with flowing curtains, and an elderly woman with kind eyes standing beside what looked like the most beautiful rose garden Nora had ever seen. As a second-year graduate student in environmental science, Nora's budget was stretched thinner than parchment paper. Her research assistantship barely covered tuition, leaving her with just enough for basic living expenses. The cramped dorm room she'd been sharing with an undergraduate who treated studying like a social activity had become unbearable. Nora needed quiet space to work on her thesis about urban pollution patterns, somewhere she could spread out her research materials and actually concentrate. The house was located in Millbrook, a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes from campus. By bus. When Nora called the number listed, a gentle voice with a slight accent answered on the second ring. Mrs. Petrov explained that she'd been living alone since her husband's death 2 years ago, and that having a student in the house would bring some much-needed life to the place. They arranged to meet the following afternoon. Nora took 2 buses to reach the address, stepping off into a tree-lined street where every house seemed to have its own personality. Mrs. Petrov's home stood out, with its cheerful yellow paint and the promised garden, which was even more spectacular in person. Roses climbed up trellises, herbs created neat borders along the walkway, and vegetables grew in organized rows that would make any farmer proud. The woman who answered the door matched the warmth suggested by the photos. Mrs. Petrov was probably in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and clothes that suggested she'd dressed up for the occasion. Her smile reached her eyes as she welcomed Nora inside, immediately offering tea and homemade cookies that smelled like cinnamon and childhood memories. The house interior was immaculate, without feeling sterile. Family photos covered the mantelpiece, showing children and grandchildren at various ages. The furniture looked comfortable and well cared for. It's a kind of pieces that had hosted decades of family gatherings. Mrs. Petrov led Nora through each room with obvious pride, explaining how she'd refinished the floors herself and pointing out the modern appliances she'd installed after moving to America 5 years earlier. The bedroom exceeded Nora's expectations completely. Large windows faced east, promising perfect morning light for her early study sessions. A sturdy desk sat positioned to take advantage of the natural illumination, while built-in bookshelves waited to house her growing collection of research materials. The bed looked comfortable, and there was enough closet space for someone who owned more than the basic student wardrobe of jeans and sweaters. During their conversation over tea, Mrs. Petrov shared stories about her 4 grown children, all successful professionals now living their busy lives across different states. She'd immigrated to be closer to her youngest daughter, but admitted that modern life left little time for the kind of close family relationships she'd known in her homeland. The house felt too big and quiet for one person, she confided, and having a student around would remind her of when her own children were pursuing their education, when they discussed practical matters. Everything seemed reasonable and straightforward. The rent included utilities, internet, and access to the full kitchen. They would share the single bathroom, but Mrs. Petrov assured Nora this wouldn't be problematic, since she kept early hours. Laundry facilities were available in the basement, and Nora could use the living areas whenever she wanted, before leaving. Yes. Mrs. Petrov pressed a container of homemade pierogi into Nora's hands, insisting that a student needed proper nutrition. The gesture felt motherly and sweet, exactly the kind of landlady relationship Nora had hoped to find. Here was someone who would provide not just housing, but perhaps even a sense of family for a graduate student far from her own relatives. As Nora rode the bus back to campus, she felt a mixture of relief and excitement. Finally, a solution to her housing crisis that wouldn't drain her bank account or compromise her studies. The thought of having her own space, a proper desk, and a kind landlady who might occasionally share home-cooked meals seemed almost too perfect. She called Mrs. Petrov that evening to accept the room, and they arranged for her to move in the following weekend. What Nora couldn't have anticipated was how differently people could interpret the concept of sharing a home. Mrs. Petrov hummed softly as she tended to her morning routine, watering the herbs on the kitchen windowsill while watching Nora hurry down the front walkway toward the bus stop. The young woman reminded her so much of her own daughters at that age, always rushing, always carrying heavy books, always looking slightly overwhelmed by the demands of academic life. It had been 3 weeks since Nora moved in. Mrs. Petrov felt a familiar maternal stirring she hadn't experienced in years in her homeland. Families took care of each other without question or hesitation. She had made sure their rooms stayed organized, their clothes were properly maintained, and their meals were nutritious and ready when they returned from their studies. It was simply what mothers did, what caring people did for those they loved. The fact that Nora wasn't technically her daughter seemed irrelevant. The girl was living under her roof, working herself to exhaustion, and clearly needed someone to look after her properly. Mrs. Petrov had noticed how Nora's room accumulated clutter throughout the week. Books scattered across the desk in seemingly random piles, clothes draped over the chair instead of hung properly, coffee cups abandoned and forgotten until they developed rings on the wooden surfaces. It pained Mrs. Petrov to see such disorder when she knew how much better Nora would feel in a clean, organized environment. A tidy space promoted clear thinking. Her own mother had taught her this wisdom decades ago. Today seemed like the perfect opportunity to help. Nora had left early for what she'd mentioned was a full day of classes and library research, meaning she wouldn't return until evening. Mrs. Petrov finished her breakfast and gathered her cleaning supplies and headed upstairs to Nora's room. The door wasn't locked, a good sign that the girl trusted her, didn't feel the need for unnecessary barriers between them. The room was exactly as Mrs. Petrov had expected. Papers covered every surface. Textbooks lay open with notes scrawled in margins. Yesterday's clothes created a small mountain on the unmade bed. Mrs. Petrov rolled up her sleeves and got to work, feeling the satisfaction that came from restoring order to chaos. She made the bed with the precise hospital corners her husband had admired, organized the books by size and subject, and gathered the scattered papers into neat stacks as she worked. Mrs. Petrov discovered interesting details about Nora's research. The papers discussed something called particulate matter concentrations in urban environments, complex scientific language that reminded her of her eldest son's engineering studies. She felt proud knowing she was housing such an intelligent young woman, someone working to make the world better through education and research. The bathroom items needed attention too. Mrs. Petrov had noticed how Nora sometimes left her shampoo bottles scattered around the tub edge or forgot to hang her towel properly after showering. These were simple oversights that any caring person would correct. She arranged the bottles in orderly rows, replaced the damp towel with a fresh one from the linen closet, and made sure the mirrors sparkled without water spots. Throughout the following days, Mrs. Petrov continued her helpful interventions. She noticed when Nora's houseplant looked slightly dry and gave it water. She observed that the room's curtains weren't positioned to take advantage of the best light and adjusted them accordingly. When she found Nora's desk supplies scattered after a late-night study session, she organized them into logical groups that would make future work sessions more efficient. Each act of service filled Mrs. Petrov with purpose and joy. This was how families functioned in her experience, everyone contributing to everyone else's well-being, without keeping score or asking permission for every small kindness. The fact that Nora sometimes seemed surprised by these improvements only confirmed that the poor girl was too overwhelmed with her studies to properly care for her living environment. Mrs. Petrov began timing her helpful activities for when Nora was away at classes. This wasn't because she was trying to be secretive, but because she didn't want to interrupt the girl's precious study time with conversation about household matters. Better to handle these small tasks quietly and efficiently, allowing Nora to focus entirely on her important academic work. When Nora mentioned feeling stressed about an upcoming presentation, Mrs. Petrov increased her efforts. She noticed the girl's sleep schedule becoming erratic, her eating habits deteriorating, and her room reflecting the chaos of a mind under pressure. This was exactly when young people needed extra support, and their own systems broke down under academic demands. The evening before Nora's presentation, Mrs. Petrov prepared a special dinner with food she remembered helping her own children feel calm and confident. She made sure Nora's presentation materials were organized neatly on the desk. Her clothes for the next day were laid out wrinkle-free, and her room environment was perfectly arranged to promote restful sleep. As she worked, Mrs. Petrov reflected on how wonderful it felt to be needed again. Her own children rarely called for advice anymore, too busy with their careers and families to remember that their mother had decades of experience managing stress and maintaining household harmony. But Nora, whether she realized it or not, has clearly benefited from having someone who cared enough to notice the small details that could make the difference between success and struggle. The next morning, Mrs. Petrov woke early as always, planning to make sure everything was perfect for Nora's important day. She could hear the shower running and realized this would be an ideal time to deliver fresh towels and perhaps offer some encouraging words about the presentation. After all, her daughters had always appreciated her support during stressful academic periods. She gathered the fluffy towels from the linen closet, thinking about how much better Nora would feel starting her day with proper comfort and care. It never occurred to Mrs. Petrov that her definition of family style support might not match Nora's expectations of landlady-tenant boundaries. The bathroom door was unlocked, which seemed like an invitation to enter with her helpful offerings. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs as she stood frozen in the shower, soap suds sliding down her face, while Mrs. Petrov's cheerful voice filled the steamy bathroom. The older woman was not only refusing to leave, but seemed to be settling in for an extended conversation, completely oblivious to the fact that Nora was naked and trapped behind a thin shower curtain. "I brought you the good towels today," Mrs. Petrov continued, and Nora could hear her moving around, apparently organizing items on the bathroom counter. "These are much softer than what you've been using. I wanted to make sure you eat a proper breakfast before your big presentation. What would you like? I could make eggs, or perhaps some of those pancakes you mentioned liking." Nora closed her eyes and tried to process this surreal situation. In her 22 years of life, she had never experienced anything remotely like this. Even in her most crowded dorm situations, basic bathroom privacy had been respected. The idea that someone would enter and remain in the bathroom while she showered was so far outside her realm of experience that she struggled to find appropriate responses. "Mrs. Petrov," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I really need you two leave the bathroom right now. We can talk about breakfast later." Instead of footsteps retreating, she heard a soft laugh. "Oh, sweetheart, don't be embarrassed. I raised 4 children, remember? There's nothing I haven't seen before. We're both women here. What's the big deal? I just want to make sure you're prepared for your important day." The casual dismissal of her discomfort made Nora's stomach clench with a mixture of anger and helplessness. She understood that Mrs. Petrov meant well, but good intentions didn't make the situation any less violating. Nora had grown up in a household where knocking before entering bedrooms was standard, where bathroom privacy was sacred, and where personal boundaries were respected even among family members. "Mrs. Petrov, I understand you want to help, but this isn't appropriate," Nora said, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. "I'm not comfortable with you being in here while I'm showering." "Comfortable?" Mrs. Petrov's tone carried a note of confusion. "What's not comfortable about it?" "I'm just trying to take care of you properly. You work so hard, always stressed about your studies. My daughters never minded when I helped them prepare for important days." Nora realized that Mrs. Petrov genuinely couldn't understand why the situation was problematic. From the older woman's perspective, this was probably just another example of family-style care, like making beds or organizing books. But Nora felt completely exposed and vulnerable, trapped in a space where she should have been able to expect complete privacy. The conversation stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes. Mrs. Petrov discussed meal options, asked detailed questions about Nora's presentation topic, and offered advice about managing academic stress, all while Nora stood naked behind the shower curtain. desperately trying to finish washing her hair and escape the increasingly surreal situation. "You know, in my country, families don't make such a big fuss about these things," Mrs. Petrov said, apparently interpreting Nora's silence as acceptance. "Americans are so worried about privacy, but what's the point? We're all human. We all have the same bodies." "My daughters learned early that there's no shame in family helping family." Nora bit back her immediate response, which was that she wasn't Mrs. Petrov's daughter and didn't want to be treated like one. The cultural difference explanation didn't make the situation less uncomfortable, but it did help her understand that Mrs. Petrov wasn't intentionally trying to violate her privacy. The older woman seemed to operate from a completely different framework, about appropriate boundaries between people sharing living space. When Nora finally turned off the water, Mrs. Petrov immediately thrust a fluffy towel toward the shower curtain. "Here you go, dear. Nice and warm. I put it in the dryer for a few minutes so it would be extra cozy for you." Nora wrapped the towel around herself and stepped out of the shower, now feeling more exposed and uncomfortable than she'd ever felt in her adult life. Mrs. Petrov beamed at her as if she'd just completed a successful mission of helpfulness, completely unaware that anything unusual had occurred. "Now, about that breakfast," Mrs. Petrov said brightly. "I'm thinking something with protein to help your brain work well during the presentation. Maybe an omelet with cheese and vegetables from the garden." Nora stared at her landlady, struggling to formulate words that would convey the seriousness of the boundary violation without causing irreparable damage to their living relationship. She was already running late for campus, her presentation. Materials still needed final organization, and she couldn't afford to have a major confrontation that might jeopardize her housing situation. "Mrs. Petrov," she said carefully, "what just happened here cannot happen again. When I'm in the bathroom, especially when I'm showering, I need complete privacy. That means you cannot come in for any reason." Mrs. Petrov's expression shifted from cheerful helpfulness to hurt confusion. "I was just trying to be a good landlady and take care of you properly. The children never made such a big deal about these things." "I'm not your child," Nora said, the words coming out more sharply than she'd intended. "And even if I were, I would still need privacy in the bathroom." The older woman's face crumpled slightly, and Nora felt a stab of guilt. She could see that Mrs. Petrov was genuinely bewildered by the conflict, probably wondering why her kindness was being rejected so harshly. But Nora also knew that if she didn't establish firm boundaries now, the situation would only escalate further. "We'll talk more about this tonight," Nora said, grabbing her clothes and toiletries. "But please, in the future, respect my privacy when I'm in the bathroom." As she hurried to get dressed, Nora's mind raced with questions about how to handle the situation. She couldn't afford to move out, but she also couldn't continue living in a place where basic privacy seemed to be considered optional. Mrs. Petrov sat in her kitchen long after Nora had rushed off to campus, nursing a cup of tea that had grown cold while she tried to understand what had gone so wrong. The hurt in the young woman's voice echoed in her mind, along with those sharp words, "I'm not your child." Of course, Nora wasn't her child. Mrs. Petrov knew that perfectly well. But did that mean she was supposed to watch someone she cared about struggle without offering help? For 68 years, Mrs. Petrov had lived by principles that seemed to be completely misunderstood in this new country. In her homeland, taking care of others wasn't something you asked permission for. It was simply what decent people did. When her neighbor's daughter was preparing for university entrance exams, the whole community pitched in. When her sister was overwhelmed with her newborn, family members appeared without invitation to cook meals and maintain the household. This was how human beings were supposed to treat each other. Mrs. Petrov thought about her own daughters now, scattered across America with their busy careers and modern lives. They called dutifully every few weeks. Conversations filled with updates about promotions and school activities and vacation plans, but lacking the deep connection she remembered from their younger years. None of them had time for the kind of close relationship she'd shared with her own mother. Daily conversations, shared meals, collaborative household management. When Alina, her youngest, had suggested that she rent out the extra bedroom, Mrs. Petrov had been skeptical. "You need the money, Mama," Alina had said during one of their efficient phone calls. and it would be good for you to have some company. But Mrs. Petrov hadn't been thinking about money when she'd welcomed Nora into her home. About family, about having someone to care for again, about the satisfaction of being needed. Now she wondered if she'd been fooling herself. Perhaps American young people truly didn't want or need the kind of nurturing that had been natural and expected in her generation. Perhaps the individualism that seemed so important in this country extended even to basic human kindness. Mrs. Petrov walked through her immaculate house, seeing it suddenly through Nora's eyes. Every surface gleamed. Every object had its designated place. Every room reflected decades of careful maintenance and attention to detail. She'd been proud of creating such a welcoming environment, but now she wondered if Nora saw it as oppressive rather than caring. The bathroom incident replayed in her mind. With new complexity, Mrs. Petrov had entered with fresh towels and motherly encouragement, thinking about how her daughters had appreciated her support during stressful times. But Nora's reaction suggested that what Mrs. Petrov considered normal family behavior was seen as a shocking invasion of privacy. The concept confused her deeply. In her childhood home, privacy had been a luxury no one could afford. 6 family members sharing 2 small rooms meant that modesty was practical rather than absolute, and taking care of each other's needs took precedence over individual comfort. Her own daughters had grown up differently, with more space and more American ideas about personal boundaries, but they'd never reacted with such distress to her motherly attention. Mrs. Petrov called her daughter Alina that afternoon, needing to talk through her confusion with someone who understood both cultures. Lena listened patiently while her mother described the morning's events, though Mrs. Petrov could hear the distraction in her voice, probably dealing with work emails. While managing the conversation, Mama Alina said when the story was finished, "You can't treat your tenant like she's your daughter. Americans are very serious about privacy, especially young women. You need to respect her space." "But she's struggling," Mrs. Petrov protested. "Her room is always messy. She forgets to eat proper meals. She stays up too late studying. If I don't help her, who will?" Elena's sigh was audible through the phone. "She's an adult, Mama. She can take care of herself. That's how things work here. People don't want family-style help from their landlady." The conversation left Mrs. Petrov feeling more isolated than before. Even her own daughter seemed to think that caring about someone's well-being was inappropriate. If it crossed certain invisible lines, how had the world become so cold and separate? And had kindness become something to be suspicious of rather than grateful for? That evening, Mrs. Petrov waited in the living room for Nora to return from campus. She'd spent the afternoon preparing what she hoped would be a peace offering, Nora's favorite soup and fresh bread, along with carefully rehearsed words about respecting boundaries. But when she heard the front door open and saw Nora's tense expression, she realized that food and good intentions might not be enough to bridge the cultural gap between them. She thought about her late husband, who had always said that love was something you showed through actions rather than words. But perhaps in America, love was something you kept contained within clearly marked boundaries. It's offered only when explicitly requested and withdrawn immediately when it made others uncomfortable. The realization filled Mrs. Petrov with a profound sadness. She'd thought she was building a new kind of family relationship with Nora, but instead she'd created conflict and discomfort. The question now was whether 2 people from such different backgrounds could find a way to live together that honored both perspectives: Nora's need for independence and privacy, and Mrs. Petrov's deep-seated instinct to nurture and care for those under her roof. Nora pushed through the front door that evening, exhaustion weighing down her shoulders like a lead blanket. The presentation had gone well enough, but the morning's bathroom incident had left her feeling unsettled and confused for the entire day. She'd spent hours between classes trying to figure out how to address the situation without destroying her living arrangement, hurting Mrs. Petrov's feelings unnecessarily. Mrs. Petrov was waiting in the living room, hands folded carefully. In her lap, with the kind of formal posture that suggested she'd been rehearsing this conversation, the coffee table held a steaming bowl of soup and fresh bread, clearly a peace offering. Though Nora wasn't sure peace was what either of them needed right now. "Nora, dear, please sit," Mrs. Petrov said, her accent seeming more pronounced than usual. "I think we need to talk about this morning." Nora settled into the opposite chair, grateful that Mrs. Petrov was willing to address the issue directly, rather than pretending it hadn't happened. I think you're right. We definitely need to talk. Mrs. Petrov's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I spoke with my daughter Alina today. She helped me understand that I made you very uncomfortable this morning. This was not my intention. But I see now that my intentions don't matter if my actions hurt you. The genuine distress in the older woman's voice made Nora's anger dissolve into something more complicated. She could see that Mrs. Petrov was struggling with concepts that challenged everything she'd been taught about caring for others. Mrs. Petrov, I know you meant well, Nora said carefully. But where I come from, even family members respect each other's privacy in the bathroom. It's not about shame or being uncomfortable with our bodies. It's about having control over when and how we're vulnerable around other people. Mrs. Petrov nodded slowly. Alina explained this to me. She said, Americans think differently about these things than we do in our homeland. But I still don't understand, if I see that you need help, how can I just ignore that? In my family, we took care of each other without asking permission. But that's the key difference, Nora said, leaning forward. Family chose to live that way together. I didn't choose to have someone take care of me like a child. I chose to rent a room from you. The words hung in the air between them, and Nora watched Mrs. Petrov process this distinction. The older woman's face shifted through several emotions, understanding, hurt, and finally, a kind of resigned acceptance. So you want me to treat you like a stranger? Mrs. Petrov said quietly. Like someone who just pays rent and nothing more? No, Nora said quickly. No, that's not what I want either. I like you, Mrs. Petrov. I enjoy our conversations in the kitchen, and I appreciate how welcoming you've been. But I need you to understand that I have to be in control of my own space and my own life. Mrs. Petrov was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she looked up, her expression was thoughtful rather than defensive. Perhaps you could help me understand where these lines are? I don't want to make you uncomfortable again, but I also don't want to become cold and distant. My husband used to say I had too much mother in me for my own good. Despite everything, Nora smiled at this. Maybe we can figure out a middle ground. What if you ask before you help with things? Like if you notice my room looks chaotic, you could mention it instead of just cleaning it yourself, if you want. To make me dinner, you could invite me rather than just planning my meals. Ask permission to be kind. Mrs. Petrov seemed to be testing the concept. This is very strange to me, but I think I understand. You want to choose when to accept help? Exactly. And some things, like bathroom privacy, aren't negotiable. I need you to respect those boundaries completely. Mrs. Petrov nodded firmly. Yes, I understand this now. Alina was very clear about this point. They spent the next hour working out practical details. Mrs. Petrov would knock before entering Nora's room, even for helpful purposes. She would ask before cooking meals for Nora, though she was always welcome to join family-style dinners if invited. The bathroom would be treated as private space, no exceptions, no emergencies that couldn't wait 5 minutes for privacy. In return, Nora agreed to be more communicative about her needs and more appreciative of Mrs. Petrov's cultural perspective. She would ask for help when she wanted it and explain when she preferred to handle things independently. I have one. More question, Mrs. Petrov said as they concluded their negotiations. If you are sick or truly struggling, may I offer help then? Not force it, but offer it? Nora considered this. Yes, but let me decide what kind of help I want. Maybe I'll want soup and sympathy, or maybe I'll just want space to recover. But I promise to tell you honestly what would be helpful. Mrs. Petrov's smile was the first genuine one Nora had seen from her all day. This I can do. And perhaps sometimes you would like to learn to cook some of my traditional recipes? Not because you need taken care of, but because you might enjoy learning? I would love that, Nora said, meaning it completely. And Mrs. Petrov? Thank you for being willing to have this conversation. I know it wasn't easy. No, Mrs. Petrov agreed. But Alina always told me that the best relationships require difficult conversations sometimes. Perhaps she was right about more than just the privacy rules. As they shared the soup Mrs. Petrov had prepared, Nora reflected on how much more complicated human relationships were than her environmental science research. But like any good research project, understanding required careful observation, honest data collection, and willingness to adjust hypotheses when the evidence suggested new conclusions. Over the following weeks, their new system worked better than either had expected. Mrs. Petrov learned to channel her nurturing instincts into invited activities, teaching Nora to make pierogi, sharing garden vegetables with permission, offering study break conversations when Nora seemed receptive. Nora discovered that having boundaries respected made her more open to accepting kindness when she genuinely wanted it. They never became the surrogate family relationship Mrs. Petrov had initially envisioned, but they built something perhaps more valuable, a friendship based on mutual respect and chosen care rather than assumed obligations. And Nora's thesis research benefited immeasurably from having a peaceful, private space where she could work without worrying about unexpected interruptions or boundary violations. Sometimes the best roommate relationships, they both learned, were built not on natural compatibility, but on the willingness to negotiate differences with patience and good faith.